June 1962. 3 prisoners vanish from the world's most secure prison, leaving behind nothing but a dummy head and a hole in the wall. But how did they escape an island that no one had ever broken out of? And did they survive the impossible waters that should have killed them? So what really happened on the night the most feared prison on Earth was finally beaten? And after more than 60 years, is it possible these men are still alive? Alcatraz, a name that struck fear into the hearts of America's most hardened criminals. This wasn't just another prison. This was a fortress, built on an island 1.25 miles offshore in San Francisco Bay. A maximum security federal penitentiary designed with one purpose: to hold the men that no other prison could contain. The island itself was surrounded by frigid waters, averaging 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill a man in less than an hour. The currents ripped through the bay at 6 to 7 knots, strong enough to sweep even the strongest swimmer out to sea. And then there were the sharks, the darkness, the complete isolation. From the moment Alcatraz opened as a federal prison in 1934, one thing was made absolutely clear: escaping Alcatraz was suicide. Attempting it meant certain death. Over 29 years, the prison would house approximately 1,576 inmates, but only the worst of the worst ended up here. This was where they sent the incorrigibles, the violent repeat offenders, the men who had caused problems in every other facility. Life on Alcatraz was designed to break you. The rules were strict: silence at meals, limited privileges, solitary confinement in D block for those who stepped out of line. The psychological toll was immense. Isolation-induced madness wasn't uncommon. This was home to America's most notorious criminals: Al Capone, the infamous Chicago gangster; George Machine Gun; Kelly, the kidnapper and bootlegger; Robert Stroud, known as the Birdman of Alcatraz. By 1962, 36 men had attempted 14 separate escapes. Most were recaptured or killed. 5 were presumed drowned, their bodies never recovered. The message was clear: no one escapes the rock. But in December of 1961, 4 men began to believe otherwise. Frank Lee Morris, prison number AZ-1441. Born September 1, 1926 in Washington, D.C. Orphaned at age 11, he cycled through foster homes and orphanages, turning to crime as a teenager. But Morris wasn't your typical criminal. He had an IQ of 133, genius level. He was quiet, calculating, affable on the surface, but always thinking 3 steps ahead. And he was an expert escape artist, having successfully broken out of the Louisiana State Penitentiary in 1955. He arrived at Alcatraz on January 18, 1960, after a 14-year sentence for burglary. The authorities thought the rock would finally hold him. They were wrong. John William Anglin and Clarence Anglin, brothers, prison numbers AZ-1476 and AZ-1485, born just 1 year apart in Donaldsonville, Georgia, into a family of 13 children. They grew up in poverty in Ruskin, Florida. No plumbing, no electricity. But poverty bred resourcefulness. As kids, they built bicycles from scraps and used dummy decoys to sneak out at night. They were skilled swimmers, having grown up swimming in the cold waters of Lake Michigan. By the 1950s, they'd graduated to bank robbery. In 1958, they stole $19,000 from the Bank of Columbia, Alabama, earning themselves 35-year sentences. But the Anglin brothers had something special. They were survivors, and they never stopped trying to escape. Multiple attempts in other prisons led to their transfers to Alcatraz. John arrived October 24, 1960. Clarence followed on January 16, 1961. The brothers were inseparable, and they had no intention of dying in prison. Alan Clayton West, prison number AZ-1335, born March 25, 1929 in New York City. Over 20 arrests for car theft and violence. Aggressive, hot-headed, creative. West had been transferred to Alcatraz in 1958 for a 10-year sentence. He'd spent time in isolation. He played the accordion. And he was about to help plan one of the most audacious escape attempts in American history. But fate had other plans for Alan West. One routine maintenance project changed everything. In 1957, 5 years before the escape, prison officials removed a ventilation fan motor from the cell block. It seemed like nothing, just routine maintenance. But it left something behind. A thin, unguarded concrete wall behind each cell. A weakness in the fortress. Frank Morris spotted it first. His cell, B142, was positioned perfectly. The Anglin brothers were in cells B140 and B144, right next to him. Alan West occupied B138, nearby. 4 cells, 4 men, 1 weakness. Morris brought the idea to the brothers. They agreed immediately. West was brought into the plan. And just like that, in December 1961, the impossible became possible. The prison that was supposed to be unbreakable suddenly had a crack. The plan was simple in concept, but would require months of painstaking, dangerous work. Each night, after lights out at 9:30, the men would begin their work. They needed to widen the 6 by 9 inch ventilation grates in their cells to 10 by 14 inches, just large enough for a grown man to squeeze through. But how do you dig through concrete when you have no tools? You improvise. They started with discarded saw blades found in the prison workshop, then metal spoons, stolen one at a time from the mess hall. But the real breakthrough came when they constructed a makeshift drill from a vacuum cleaner motor, powered by stolen electrical wires. Night after night, they chipped away at the concrete. The noise should have given them away instantly. But Morris had a solution. During music hour, he would play his accordion. The sound echoing through the cell block and masking the grinding, scraping sounds coming from the cells. To hide the damage during the day, they painted pieces of cardboard to match the cell walls perfectly, propping them up over the holes. Guards walked past multiple times a day and saw nothing. It took months. Months of back-breaking work, of holding their breath during inspections, of taking turns so the others could rest. But finally, after 6 months of digging, the vents were wide enough. Step 1 was complete. Behind their cells lay a dark, forgotten utility corridor, just 3 feet wide, filled with plumbing pipes and dust. It was unguarded, unused, and perfect. Once through their vents, the men could squeeze into this corridor, but they didn't stop there. Using the pipes as a ladder, they climbed 30 feet up through the darkness to the top of the cell block. Here, in a cramped space above the cells, they discovered something remarkable, a hidden area where no guard ever went. This became their workshop, their factory, their salvation. Night after night, they smuggled materials up through the corridor. Over 50 raincoats, some stolen, some donated by other inmates who had no idea what they were for. These weren't just any raincoats. The men had discovered a technique from magazines like Popular Mechanics, vulcanization. Using steam from the prison's pipes, they heat-sealed the raincoats together, creating a waterproof raft measuring 6 feet by 14 feet. They built life preservers the same way, inflatable jackets that could keep them afloat in the frigid bay waters. They carved paddles from plywood scraps, stolen from the prison workshop. They even constructed a makeshift bellows from a concertina, allowing them to inflate their raft and life vests quickly. They studied magazines like Sports Illustrated, learning about navigation buoys and channels. They prepared makeshift wetsuits from prison clothing and took cold baths in their cell sinks, conditioning their bodies for the shock of the bay. Everything they needed was being built in secret, right above the heads of the guards. But escaping the cell block was only half the battle. The bay was waiting. There was one critical problem. The guards conducted bed checks throughout the night. If the men's beds were empty, the alarm would sound immediately, and the escape would be over before it began. They needed decoys. And not just any decoys. They needed to be perfect. Using materials they'd gathered over months, the men went to work creating one of the most famous pieces of evidence in criminal history, the dummy heads. The base was made from soap powder mixed with toilet paper and concrete dust, molded carefully over weeks into the rough shape of a human head. They were surprisingly heavy, surprisingly real, but the details made them legendary. They stole art supplies from the prison workshops, paints in various skin tones. They carefully painted each head to match their own complexion, adding subtle variations in shading. And then came the hair. Real human hair, collected from the prison barbershop, carefully glued strand by strand onto each head. When they were finished, the dummy heads were astonishingly lifelike, in the dim light of a nighttime bed check. With the heads placed carefully on pillows and blankets arranged to mimic sleeping bodies, they were nearly impossible to distinguish from real inmates. But these weren't just art projects. They were survival. One mistake here, one guard who looked too closely, and they'd be shot on sight. June 11th, 1962, 9:30 p.m. Lights out. For 6 months they'd planned. For 6 months they'd prepared. Tonight, everything came together. The men placed their dummy heads carefully on their pillows, arranging clothing and towels beneath the blankets to mimic the shape of sleeping bodies. In the darkness, they were perfect. One by one, Morris and the Anglin brothers squeezed through their widened vents and into the utility corridor behind the cells. But then, disaster. Alan West couldn't get out. The cement around his vent had hardened since the last time he'd checked it. He tried desperately to chip away at it, but time was running out. The others couldn't wait. Morris made the call. They were leaving. Now. West was left behind, still frantically working at his cell vent as his partners climbed up through the darkness. The 3 men ascended the 30 feet of pipes to their workshop, gathering the raft, the life vests, and the paddles they'd spent months creating. They climbed higher still, reaching a ventilator shaft that led to the roof. They'd removed the rivets weeks ago. Around 11 p.m., they pushed through onto the roof of Alcatraz, and then a loud crash echoed across the prison yard. One of them had slipped or knocked something loose. The sound should have brought guards running, but incredibly, unbelievably, the guards ignored it. The 3 men moved quickly across the roof, visible from the guard tower, but somehow unnoticed. They reached the bakery smokestack on the north side of the building, a 50-foot drop to the ground. Using sheets tied together as a rope, they descended into the darkness. At the bottom, they faced 2 12-foot-high barbed wire fences. Using cutting tools they'd made, they sliced through both barriers. By 11:30 p.m., they'd reached the northeast shoreline of the island, a blind spot away from the guard towers and searchlights. The water was black, the current was strong, the air was cold. They inflated their raft using the concertina bellows, pulling on their life vests. Their plan was to head north to Angel Island, 2 miles away. 7 a.m., June 12th, 1962. Bed check. A guard moved down the cell block, doing his routine count. Cell B140, cell B142, cell B144. Everything appeared normal, men sleeping peacefully in their beds. But something felt off. The guard reached Clarence Anglin's cell and tapped the head on the pillow. It rolled off and hit the floor with a hollow thud. For a moment, the guard stared in disbelief at the painted soap and papier-mâché head staring back at him. Then, all hell broke loose. Sirens wailed across Alcatraz Island. Guards rushed to the cells. Morris, gone. John Anglin, gone. Clarence Anglin, gone. Only Alan West remained, still in his cell, his vent finally chipped open, but far too late. The impossible had happened. 3 men had escaped the rock. Within hours, the FBI, Coast Guard, military police, and local law enforcement launched one of the largest manhunts in American history. Boats scoured the bay. Helicopters circled overhead. Checkpoints were established on every bridge and highway. Relatives of the Anglin brothers were monitored. Boat operators were questioned. And then the evidence started washing up. On June 14th, 2 days after the escape, a wooden paddle was discovered 200 yards off Angel Island. It matched the materials from the workshop. Near the same location, a wallet was found containing contact information for the Anglin family. On June 21st, 9 days after the escape, a homemade life vest washed ashore at Cronkite Beach, near the Golden Gate Bridge. It bore what some claimed were teeth marks, though whether from human desperation or a shark attack was never determined. The next day, a second life vest was found just 50 yards from Alcatraz Island. Pieces of rubber inner tubes and fragments of the raft were scattered throughout the bay, but no bodies, no footprints on Angel Island, no stolen cars reported, no credible sightings on the mainland. Alan West, still in custody, told investigators everything. He described the plan in detail, the 6 months of preparation, the workshop, the route they'd planned to take. Based on the evidence, the FBI reached a conclusion. The men drowned. The water temperature, the violent currents, the distance to shore. It was too much. Even with the raft and life vests, even with their preparation, the bay had claimed them like it had claimed so many before. With no bodies recovered, no confirmed sightings, and no evidence of survival. The case was officially closed on December 31st, 1979, presumed dead, but the case was never truly solved. The FBI investigation lasted 10 days of intensive searching, followed by months of following up leads and monitoring the families. The official stance never wavered. The men died in the bay. The cold water would have induced hypothermia within 20 to 60 minutes. The currents would have swept their bodies out to the Pacific Ocean, where they'd never be found. The U.S. Marshals Service took over the case when the FBI officially suspended it, and technically, the case remains open to this day. Arrest warrants for Morris and the Anglin brothers won't expire until they would have reached 100 years old, between 2026 and 2031. But the American public was stunned. For nearly 3 decades, Alcatraz had been sold as the perfect prison, the unbeatable fortress. The myth was that simple: you can't escape the rock. 3 men with spoons and stolen raincoats had just shattered that myth. Media coverage was intense. The story became a national sensation. Prison officials faced tough questions about how such an elaborate escape could have been planned for 6 months without being detected. The truth was embarrassing. The prison was aging, crumbling from saltwater erosion. Operating costs had skyrocketed to $10 per inmate per day, compared to $3 at other facilities. Security gaps were becoming more obvious. The 1962 escape became the final nail in the coffin. On March 21, 1963, less than a year after the escape, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary closed its doors forever. But here's where the story gets truly strange. In the years following the escape, the Anglin family began receiving Christmas cards, unsigned, but with handwriting that matched John and Clarence's writing style. In 1975, the family received a photograph taken in Brazil. It showed 2 men standing together, and when forensic analysts examined it decades later using facial recognition technology, the results were startling. One man matched John Anglin exactly, the other matched Clarence closely. The family claimed the brothers had told them before the escape that if they succeeded, they'd meet in Brazil. They said the men had worked on a remote farm until the 1990s. In 2018, a letter arrived at the San Francisco Police Department, allegedly written by John Anglin. It read, "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely. Frank passed away in 2008. My brother died in 2011. If you announce on TV that I'll be promised to just go to jail for no more than a year and get medical attention, I will write back to let you know exactly where I am." This is no joke. The letter was analysed. The handwriting was inconclusive. No deal was made. No one came forward. But the theories didn't stop there. In 2014, researchers at Delft University in the Netherlands conducted tidal simulations of San Francisco Bay conditions on the night of June 11, 1962. Their conclusion: if the men had launched their raft between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, as West described, survival was entirely possible. The currents could have carried them to Horseshoe Bay on the mainland. In 2003, the television show Mythbusters attempted to recreate the escape using the same materials and methods. They succeeded, reaching land safely. In 2025, YouTuber and engineer Mark Robber conducted another test. Again, success. The escape was feasible. Some theories go even further. That the men were towed across the bay by accomplices using an electrical cord, or that they met a getaway boat arranged by mobster Mickey Cohen, or that they flew to Mexico before heading to South America. The U.S. Prize Marshals maintain age-progressed photographs of what Morris and the Anglin brothers would look like today if they were still alive. They still accept tips. they still investigate credible leads. Because the truth is, no one knows what happened after 11:40 p.m. on June 11th, 1962. Three men entered the freezing black waters of San Francisco Bay on a moonless night in June 1962. They had no training, no support, just spoons, stolen raincoats, and months of desperate planning. The official story says they drowned within minutes, their bodies swept out to sea and lost forever. But no bodies were ever found. No confirmed deaths, no closure, just a wooden paddle, a wallet, 2 life vests, and 60 years of questions. Did they die that night in the cold, dark waters, their dreams of freedom sinking with them? Or did they pull off the greatest prison escape in history and live the rest of their lives in the shadows, looking over their shoulders, always wondering if the knock on the door would finally come? The FBI says they're dead. The families say they survived. The evidence points both ways. And so the mystery endures. 3 dummy heads on 3 prison pillows. 3 men who vanished into the night. 3 names that will never be forgotten. Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin. To this day, no one knows.